everybody, to Radicalized, where truth survives, and we always have your back. We are on episode 64, and I don't know, guys, we may have outdone ourselves this time. Like, I'm not sure, but we just had like a, member of a UK Parliament join us, so we have quite a show for you. My name's Heidi Cuda. We are here with Jim Stewartson, High Fidelity. We are an investigative show about disinformation. And yeah, we have Ian Lucas with us today. He wrote a book about digital gangsters. We're going to be talking a lot about that. We're going to be talking a lot about truth today and the unfettered disruption of truth due to big tech's lack of regulation, because clearly they can't regulate themselves. Am I right about that, gentlemen?
Oh, they could pretend to regulate themselves, but they never really accomplish anything.
No, the purpose of them owning these social networks is so that they're not regulated, because they are using them as radicalization engines for their political, financial, and geopolitical power objectives.
Word. Our guest today retired after 18 years in UK Parliament because he felt such an urgency to write his book, Digital Gangsters, the inside story of how greed, lies, and technology broke democracy. So I know y'all are going to buy his book. It's available right now at Byline Times website, and it is so damn important. And you will recognize Ian Lucas, many of our viewers, because he was part of the committee in the UK that was interviewing the Alexander Nixes and the Facebook execs. And you're going to see a little clip of that because the work that they did, every time there was another committee hearing, I was literally on pins and needles. All I did was watch for hours to see what the reveals were going to be. So we'll be talking a lot about that and how all the same characters are the same characters who've been trying to harm our democracy. So anyway, anything else before we jump into Front Loaded? Let's do this.
Front Loaded.
So I'm always telling you guys about the investigations that I'm working on and how, I'm working on something super important. Well, I don't think I overstated the importance of my latest and Byline supplement. I think it might have been one of the most important ones I've ever undertaken, but it's a look at how the Russian Federation joined with anti-vaxxers to wage biological warfare by proxy against the West. And it wasn't really hard because Putin puppet Trump did same. And the report shows the CNP's role. It shows Pollyanna Pence and how fossil fuel interests may have played a big part in the spreading of said disinformation. So I ask everybody to please read that article. I know that when I get into these deep dives that there's a lot of words, but I encourage you to please read all of them because by mapping out the history of the last few years when it came to all the anti-science rhetoric, it really shows how we were sabotaged and hundreds of thousands of people are no longer with us. I was crying when I wrote this piece, like literally, like it's, people are going to look around, people in the cult, and they are going to hear the ghost of loved ones saying, get out of the cult. I'm dead because you listened to the cult. But this is something I want you to chew on. You remember when Twitter was the kind of place where people would give you information and you'd go, wow, well, that happened again. I was reminded when I put this story out over the weekend, I was reminded by a Twitter pal that it was Trump back in the aughts who was spreading anti-vax rhetoric based on a debunked study about autism. And I'd forgotten about that. This anti-science bullshittery with him, this is a long game. And guess who else was spreading that information? The frickin' Russian Federation. So, how much more evidence do we need about collusion between Trump and Russia? So I just think that was a very important footnote. Anything else before I continue?
I was just going to say that I think casting it the way that you did as biological warfare is incredibly important, right? Because it is nothing short of biological warfare to use information to cause people to get sick and die. that's fucking biological warfare, whether you actually, like, sprinkle the shit in the water system or not. Yourself, you're still making people die because of biological viruses. So I think that's really important, Heidi, and thank you for that.
I mean, no one gets out alive in that story. I mean, I get into Pence, you know what I mean? Because Pence was supposed to be in charge of the response, and he was busy tweeting and deleting tweets about Trump's great, response to things. I mean, it's
He did an op-ed that said it was going to be over in a couple of
I
months.
know. I include that in there too. It's what Ruth taught us. We don't memory hole any of this. We can't. There are hundreds of thousands of people no longer with us because another thing I learned about Ruth is these dictators, they do not care about their population. They do not care about their citizens. Don't even like them. Don't care if they die. If it benefits fossil fuel interests, all the better. Hi-fi?
I think eventually when history is written, that it will look back at this period of time and it will say that enemies of the United States, in an attempt to weaken that country, worked with individuals inside of the United States and were successful in allowing a containable plague to spread. And as such, at least 1 million Americans met their deaths. That's how this is going to be written, folks. Remember which side you're going to be on.
I thank you for that hi-fi. I want to point out that one of the people who came up in my story as funding a lot of the anti-science bullshittery rhetoric was none other than Robert Mercer. Why that's important is we're going to be talking to former MP in Parliament, who is the one who was part of the team that really exposed what Cambridge Analytica was involved in, SCL. And who funded Cambridge Analytica? None other than Robert Mercer, who is also behind Breitbart, who is also behind Parler, gave money to Citizens United. Need I go on? We have these bad actors in America and not enough sunlight on them.
Also, funded Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel been playing with Mercer money for decades.
And Bannon. Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
yes,
obviously.
Mercer got rid of Bannon, and then Bannon got guess who?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Who just got what? Arrested.
Yeah. The good news is.
And his apartment magically caught on fire while the FBI was there.
That's weird. Yeah.
So weird. It's weird how that happens.
So let's get on to more of these bad actors being exposed, shall we? Because we had quite a big week, and I don't want to undersell how important this week was. But let's get to pudding fingers. As Ruth calls them, Florida fascist used Kremlin lingo, territorial dispute, when referencing Putin's war in Ukraine, and it actually dinged him in polls, or maybe it was the pudding fingers anecdote. But I do hope to see a swift end to his cruelty. He's actually tanking right now in polls. That matters because he has been little Mussolini in Florida, and that is why Ruth nicknamed him Florida fascist. And I also think that defascist is another good nickname for him if you're looking for him. But it's very important to note that he exposed himself as being another pro-Kremlin operative in America when he minimized Putin's war in Ukraine as a doesn't want to become further entangled in a territorial dispute. This is not a territorial dispute. That is Kremlin propaganda. It's important to note that words matter in this cognitive warfare, obviously, that we're in. Jim?
DeSantis also hired Christina Pushaw, who is a fucking Kremlin asset. Also presides over Florida, which is a giant fucking Russian mafia state. So, let's get clear about the sanctimonious, to borrow Donald Trump's phrase word, A motherfucker is the dirtiest, most crass, cynical piece of shit in the country, and that is saying something.
That is saying something. Yeah, that's saying something.
I've actually decided that I'm going to make stickers that have an image of 3 fingers covered in pudding.
Oh no.
And they're just going to say, Puddin' Fingers is a Putin proxy.
Oh, I love alliteration. That's brilliant, Hi-Fi.
And we'll just put them up everywhere.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Sign me up. Hey, thanks. That said, we can probably do that actually in real life because we have 3 new Patreons. So thank you so very much. You guys really matter to us. And as soon as we have a spare second, we're going to be hosting a Zoom for all y'all. So thank you so much for supporting our show. It means a lot. And so, yeah, you guys will be paying for the stickers that Hi-Fi is going to make on Puddin' Fingers. All right. So moving right along, let's get to Betty's Weekly Roundup because it has all the info about Putin's arrest warrant for trafficking children and Trump's potential perp walk and whether or not he'll be a backdoor man. That is all found at my Substack, Heidi Cuda Substack. And remember, stop right there for just one hot second on Julia Davis, who I absolutely adore. She's the one who always tells us what the Russian propagandists are saying. And I knew some of the narratives, and Hi-Fi, you speculated. As our viewers already know, Vladimir Putin has an arrest warrant after him by the ICC, who declared the arrest warrant because he has been trafficking children out of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. We always say this on this show, and Jim has said it more than anybody. Everything with these goons is about projection. They always project onto others what they themselves are actually doing. So all those psyop people out there that think the Democrats are, harming children or whatever, no, it's Vladimir Putin, the Hydra head of this cabal, who's actually trafficking children. I opened with Julia Davis, though, because she actually cites a Russian propagandist, basically threatening nuclear war over this. And of course, Julia says yawn. And as I write, I don't think these guys, these oligarchs, the pickled oligarchs, want to bomb all their stuff. All their money's laundered in the West. But yes, my Substack is where propaganda goes to die. Check it out. All the roundups are always free, unpaywalled. So
the reason I predicted that Putin would ultimately end up on his nukes is because it's become more and more obvious that he has nothing else left. The West is cutting off his oligarchs from their resources. The money that is being filtered back through him from America is going to run out eventually. He doesn't have, he's getting bullets from China currently. He doesn't have the manufacturing infrastructure to keep up with the number of tanks he's going to have to build, right? All he has left is his nuclear weapons. And that's why I said that's what he's going to fall back on. And yep, that's what he did.
Well, that's what his propagandists fell back on. I don't want to frighten people because, we know it's not going to end.
He won't actually push the button.
I don't believe so. Jim, anything before we move on to word phrase of the week?
No, let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right. Word phrase of the week this week, we're going to talk about algopopulism or algorithmic populism. And what is algorithmic populism? This is something that started during the digital age. And what it is algorithms pushing people towards cults of personality, large leaders, voices that stand out politically. Wow. This is very, very dangerous. Wow. Because as we will learn, it can be manipulated and used against large swaths of populations.
Wow.
To completely change them.
That's what we talked about when we had Jen Senko on, the brainwashing of my dad, because, and we learned from a woman in the UK that her father was just algorithmically being fed all of this right-wing stuff coming from the Bannon Farage camp a lot of this in the lead up to Brexit. So that's really important.
This is also a tactic of paleo conservatives for a very long time. The use of the internet is the innovation here, but this is just identity politics, right? So what they do is they feed you an algorithm that sucks you into an identity group that welcomes you in, but makes you an in group and everybody else an out group. That is what the algorithm does now, but used to happen in neo-Nazi clubs or small little bulletin boards, but now it's just out in the open, and it's just open psychological warfare, and it all goes back to guess who? Mike fucking Flynn.
Yeah.
Mike Flynn is using 4GW, which is fourth generation warfare, which comes from a guy named William Lind. And his entire project was to figure out how to dismantle global liberal democracy. And Mike Flynn has picked it up, rebranded it as 5GW, and is now selling books at Barnes & Noble to teach you how to do it. So algorithmic populism is not only something that social media companies do, now you can do it too.
So, Jim, is anybody protesting Barnes and Nobles? Is there anything that has been occurring to get Barnes and Nobles to not put out his book?
No, they don't give a shit. They're like on that verge of bankruptcy, and it's if it's selling,
okay,
they don't give a shit.
Well, they should, because on their epitaph will be, we sold books on fascism. So,
well, to be clear, it's not just books on fascism. It's a book, a how-to manual on how to make people kill people. That's one of the chapter titles.
Jesus Christ!
It's a map for how to radicalize people all the way to the point where they will kill other people. So that's the literal fucking goal of the book, and they're selling it in Barnes. So knock yourself out, guys.
I'll make sure to tweet this clip out to Barnes and Noble anyway, even if they are on their last leg. Let me ask you one other thing. Do any quote unquote legitimate networks platform Mike Flynn anymore? Or are all the video clips I see of him just on the real sketchy ass extremist far right fascist sites?
No, I mean, he was on Tucker a few months ago.
Okay.
It's like that. Like, sure, they'll still platform him, in the ultra Fox News crowd.
Okay.
But for the most part, he's slumming with the, Stu Peters and the,
okay.
QAnon people.
All right. I just needed to know. Okay. That's important.
Well, that's also dangerous, because as the in-group gets smaller, they tend to become more radical and more violent. Yeah.
Okay.
No, over time, if people don't get out of it, it doesn't get better.
Yeah.
That's not a thing that happens. It is a progressive process.
Okay.
And ultimately you end up with David fucking DePate.
Okay. Yeah, it's really important. All right. Thank you for that. That was really important. Hi-Fi. So let's jump into why it matters.
Why does it matter? Why does it matter? By High Fidelity.
First story this week. We're going to talk about Ohio's own Sinyaya Galachka. Yes, that's right. Pro-Moscow voices tried to steer Ohio train disaster debate. Turns out there were a bunch of accounts that pushed pro-Russian propaganda and actually used video clips of the disaster and politicians talking about the disaster that had Russian subtitles. when asked why did you use Russian subtitled video, they simply claimed that it was the easiest for us to get. It's become terribly, terribly obvious that nation states are using social media to engage in narrative warfare against each other, and this is just one more in a growing mountain of evidence that this occurs. So, where are our politicians? I would ask, are they complicit or are they simply incompetent? And that is why it matters.
I love this one. This one's because if anyone was paying attention while this shit was going on, right, there was a lot of people saying, "Oh, the Biden administration is complicit in all the chemical warfare on the peoples." Right. The interesting part of it was a perfect horseshoe. You
Yeah.
had Tulsi over here and fucking Jimmy Dore and all the leftists are, oh, the Biden administration is just the same as Trump, right? And then you had all the people like the Josh Hawleys and shit going into the water and like setting it on fire and shit. You know, oh, look, there's oil. You can see chemicals in the water. It's just an embarrassing shit show on both sides to try and make what was the Trump administration's fault for letting the goddamn regulations off the hook.
Yeah.
They tried to turn it into some kind of fucking geopolitical disaster for Biden on both sides.
So,
well, they did also try to say that, Biden will send billions to Ukraine, but nothing for the people of Ohio. I would like to remind everyone that President Biden called Ohio Governor Mike DeWine within, 72 hours or something of the disaster occurring and said, "We're here if you need us." Yeah. And Mike DeWine said, "No, we're good."
Yeah, these assholes will use anything. First of all, truth means nothing to them. And this whole theme of this episode is truth. So they can go there, light whatever ass on fire they want to, and look like jackasses doing it. Where was our president? He was in Ukraine, right? He was in Ukraine just owning Putin. That's where he was. And he absolutely offered to help. And what did Trump do? Go throw some paper towels over there? I mean, it was just... they only care about politicizing things. They don't care who's hurt, as the whole top of the show explained with the hundreds of thousands of people who now are dead because they only cared about the politics of the pandemic and not about truly helping people. I think that's evident. Yeah, Jim?
Oh, I was just wondering if maybe Josh Hawley should show up with some fucking paper towels and, clean up the river.
That'd be nice. I'd like to see actually less of Josh.
It'd be great.
Hawley.
I mean, it'd be a good PR stunt for them. You have Trump throwing paper towels to Josh Hawley in the river, cleaning up the Biden chemical warfare.
Oh my God! The only thing that could be better is if Putin's finger showed up in boots. Puss in boots. I think we just got a meme. Okay. We'll give a prize. Whoever can make that meme from our viewers, we'll do some sort of Zoom chat with you. So let's do it. All right.
Next story this week, we're going to talk about ransom nudes. Yes, that's right. A cancer patient is suing a hospital after a ransomware gang leaked her nude medical photos. Apparently, there were photos of this and some other women who were taken from the waist up naked because they were undergoing cancer treatment. They were seized by the ransomware gang and leaked online as proof of, we have your data. And how did the hospital respond? They offered the victim 2 years of credit monitoring. So, we need to talk about software liability, the problems with institutions having data that they don't necessarily need, or if they do need it, not securing it. And what happens to that data when it gets leaked into the wild? And I guess that's quite a bit to say about that. But that's why it matters.
Well, we talked about it as post-privacy world, but I mean, the very first time I knew how doomed we were, I was getting my hearing checked, many years of nightclubs, and I just wanted to make sure I was okay. And I could see the screen from the, nurse who was checking my hearing. It had my entire medical history right there on the screen. And it's just like, why does somebody checking my hearing need to have my entire medical history? And that's the world that we're in.
Well, a big part of the problem is when people's medical histories leak into the wild, invariably they're not only possibly embarrassing physical health things that people undergo, but there's also mental health data that can be used specifically to target people based on neuroses, phobias, etc.
Depression,
You name it, grief,
isms.
Yeah,
right.
So
yeah, we don't need to put everything online. We should have thought about that. So.
Or
all right.
If we do, lock it the fuck down and make it legally liable for holding on to it. So
yeah,
there you go. Final story this week: Carter Casey and the CIA. So a new story came out where an individual stated that they were part of the October surprise to sabotage Jimmy Carter's reelection. There's a lot of rumors around this. However, I will tend to believe this story that the Reagan administration did illegally meddle in foreign policy prior to Reagan's election, for the simple fact that William J. Casey was involved. And if you know anything about William J. Casey, you know that he worked closely in Vietnam with Jack Singlaub, and that Jack Singlaub was part of the Iran arms deal. And actually, the probe into the Iran hostage situation was linked to the Iran-Contra deal. So, maybe a little conspiratorial, but if somebody's saying it, I'm going to tend to believe it, simply because Carter, Casey, and the CIA.
So, let's talk about William Casey for a second.
Sure.
William Casey is the center of a huge beast. William Casey, first of all, is a Knight of Malta, was a Knight of Malta, which is still fighting the Crusades. Another Knight of Malta is Eric fucking Prince. William Casey also, during the same time that he's committing this fuckery, was founding the Manhattan Institute. The Manhattan Institute is, all it does is psyops, anti-democratic psyops against the United States of America, and it's been doing it for 50 fucking years. 45. William Casey founded it in the late 70s at the same time as, I'm sure, 100% he's rat fucking Jimmy Carter. No question in my mind, right? Because guess what happens to William Casey? He becomes Reagan's CIA director until he dies several years later during what? The Iran-Contra investigation, which was covered up by who? William fucking Barr. Who else? Who did William Barr get off? Also, Mike Flynn. We were talking about Jack Singlaub. Mike Flynn took over Jack Singlaub's organization called America's Future, which Singlaub started in 1946 because he did not like the way that World War II went. We are talking about the center of a fucking, talk about neo-Nazis. This is a neo-Nazi movement, old school, started all the way from when the Nazis got defeated the first time. Arrest Mike Flynn.
Thank you for coming to Jim's TED Talk. So I was trying to explain to somebody who was
a lot
not
of names and things.
who,
I hope it was.
no,
It's a network.
I
You have to
followed it.
understand the
I
network.
followed it. Yeah. So I followed it. I was trying to explain to somebody how safe and wonderful it felt having Jimmy Carter as president. He was somebody who was an environmentalist. You know, he was a good man. As a kid, I knew this was a good man, and I just felt safe. And I hated the 80s. The 80s were just, for me, it was the greed is good and all the biffs. I didn't like the greed and the biffs. So moving right along.
Jim Stewartson's hellscape. Oh, fuck.
I just want to, this is going to be a short one. I did a Twitter space a couple of days ago about PSYOPs. And, you know, we're going to be talking to Ian Lucas about PSYOPs. Although we won't use that word much because there are many ways of looking at these problems, right? This insurgency, this radicalization we see. You can think of it as a political problem, right? There's all this influence in politics, right? You can see it as a social problem, which is, you know, there are some large percentage of the population is, you know, suffering undue influence, right? That's a social problem, a big one. You can look at it in many different ways, but we're not looking at it as what it actually is, what the purpose of it is, and how it works, which is psychological warfare. It's really as simple as that. And there's a massive blind spot in the press and in our government. They refuse to acknowledge that entire layer of reality, right? We will talk about the symptoms. We will talk about the effect that it has on all of us, you know, how we feel. But we won't talk about the fact that this stuff is being weaponized intentionally to make those feelings happen, to make our relatives get sucked away into some fucking fascist cult. We see all this evidence around us, like people dropping like flies, right? People saying crazy shit. Governors off, you know, trying to secede from the union and you know, create fascist empires, right? We see all this fucking crazy stuff going on, and we don't talk about why. We don't talk about the actual weaponry that's being used to make this stuff happen. It's really that simple of a problem that all of us are suffering this bullshit. We feel it every day. We know it. You can't escape it. But our journalists are up here like, woo, look at all the crazy QAnon people. What are they doing? You know, without actually thinking about what it means. If somebody believes that stuff, what does that mean? What does it mean if grandma all of a sudden thinks that you're a pedo? What the fuck does that mean? It means her brain got changed. Literally. And unless you believe that grandma has some natural desire to believe that, then you have to understand that that was an involuntary thing. It was something that was done to her. And if you if you can just get to that point, right? Believe, wait a second, what happened to grandma? Probably didn't happen, because she meant it to happen. What does it mean? It means that she was attacked. She was attacked by weaponry that is visible to all of us. We see it every day. We even talk about it. Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, What are they doing? They're engaging in psychological warfare. It's really, really that simple. And until we collectively get our brains around it, we're going to keep reporting on the symptoms. We're going to keep freaking out because all this crazy stuff is going on, but we don't have the vocabulary or the framework to talk about it. So I'm just here to say, look, again, you are not crazy. You're not crazy for thinking that the world is crazy. The world is crazy. And there are reasons for it. And we're here to try and help, at least make you feel like it's not you that's going nuts here. It's the world, and that's intentional. There are people doing that on purpose, and we need to put them in prison. Arrest Mike Flynn.
We told you we were going to talk about truth and we were going to bust through some ignorance. And that's exactly what we're going to do with our guest, Ian Lucas. He stepped down after 18 years serving in UK Parliament because there was such an incredible urgency to write his book, Digital Gangsters, the inside story of how greed, lies, and big tech broke democracy. He sat on the committee that actually spotlighted all this stuff a few years ago, and we were watching it all unfold like a tragic whodunit. So I want you guys to see a clip of him in action. He's an attorney by training, and he went Columbo style on a Facebook executive.
My opponent can purchase advertising from Facebook in the campaign. It's unlawful for someone to pay for that advertising from outside the UK. It's impossible for me as a candidate to check where that advertising is bought from. Can you assure me that foreign donors do not pay for campaign advertisements purchased in Britain today?
I can't assure you of that, no.
Do you hold that information at Facebook?
No, in the sense of what we will know is when somebody, let me try and think about the scenario. So if somebody is buying adverts for your to run a campaign in your constituency during the election,
yes,
we can see the account that's paid for the ads. We won't know where the money's come from to go into that account.
Do you know where the account that's paid for the ads is from outside the UK?
We will have information that will enable us to know who's paying for those ads, yes.
So you know that's illegal? If someone paid from outside the UK for
yes,
an account?
I am aware of that.
So you are aware of that. So do you prevent that from happening?
We don't at the moment, but we do. My understanding is this is a matter for the Electoral Commission.
No, it's a matter for you. It's a matter for you.
Actually, Mr. Lucas, isn't it a matter for the person paying for the ad?
No,
they have to ensure that they comply with the law.
No, it's a matter for you because you are not complying with the law either, because you are facilitating an illegal act.
I've never heard that analysis before. If you've got something you can share with us that demonstrates that, I'd be interested to see.
You see, this is the problem, Mr. Milner. You have everything. You have all the information. You have all of this information. We have none of it because you won't show it to us.
But well, as I've explained, Mr. Lucas, we are moving forward with the new forms of political advertising transparency, which will enable you to have this information.
So there is a problem?
Yes.
Wow, we are so grateful that you are here with us, Ian Lucas. We have already teased our viewers a bit about your new book, Digital Gangsters, which I think is a brilliant title. But I also think it's really important that our viewers know that after 18 years serving in UK Parliament, you actually retired in order to write this book because there was an urgency to it. Can you please tell our viewers why it was so important for you to do that?
Well, I've been in politics for 40 years, 20 years in the British Parliament, and I felt that politics had really changed beneath my feet. Now, I was a politician in this period, and I myself didn't realize what had happened. And it was through the committee, the Disinformation Committee that I worked on in the last Parliament in which I served, that I discovered what had actually happened and how there had been elections in the UK, and including the Brexit referendum, which is a massive political event in our country and for Europe, which had been affected in a way that at the time I just didn't understand. I had tried to highlight this in Parliament through various speeches and found that the political context was so difficult because of the Brexit discussion that was going on in the Parliament that I was just not being listened to, even within the Parliament itself, speaking from the hallowed green benches of the House of Commons. And I wanted to get my story across and the message across to people who are generally interested in politics, but weren't tech people, which was really described me. This was a voyage of discovery for me in the most recent Parliament that I worked in. And so I felt that I just needed to explain the complexity of the story, the importance of the story, and why we need to act to safeguard the very fundamentals of our democracy.
Thank you so much for that incredible intro. The gentlemen know that I spent a year in community politics. As you noted in your book, you did a lot of canvassing, as did, I was a campaign manager canvassing with my candidate. And I describe what I did. My job was scheduling and the day-to-day and all of that as a manager. But truly what my job was managing all the explosions on Nextdoor and dealing with all of the social media online harms and attacks. And there has been no framework. I have to call these guys when we're under assault. There has been no real movement to do anything about just how vitriolic and horrible the online world is. And what you revealed in your book and in your process of discovery, and I was telling you, your book really reads like a whodunit, is you basically revealed that truth as we know it is completely under assault, and how that is impacting democracy has been completely undersold.
I think that genuinely, even now, most politicians don't understand the seriousness of this, because the whole concept of democracy is to have opposing ideas being argued openly between candidates or between proponents of the different ideas. And what's happened with social media is that we've created ghettos of people who generally have a similar viewpoint, and that within those ghettos, views are reinforced and never challenged. So there's no democratic debate taking place. And the most worrying thing of all is that this has now become the most important battleground in political campaigns. The online world, which focuses only on selling one side of a story, is the most important place where political money is spent and where political ideas are actually put forward. And it's an unchallenged world, and it's an uncontrolled world in terms of the governing of elections. That's something that's entirely novel in Britain. And just to give you one example of this, In the UK, unlike in the United States, I was never allowed, it was illegal for me to make a televised political advert, because that wasn't felt to be an appropriate way for a political campaign to be conducted. Now, what that meant historically for the whole of my political career was that the amount of money that I spent on a campaign was very limited, because I couldn't buy TV advertising or anything of that nature. And that has been wholly undermined by the onset of social media, which is ungoverned. And even in the UK, where we made a decision a long time ago not to have broadcast political adverts, now we have them. And we've never even discussed that huge step, even in the UK Parliament. So there's been a massive change, which most politicians in the UK don't even understand.
One of the accounts that was libeling my candidate, who is now a city councilwoman, worked for the opponent's campaign. And this was happening on Twitter over and over again. And there was no recourse over that. There was no, this is a paid, advertisement from the opponent's campaign. It was just vitriol, libeling, harms that were occurring with no recourse. So this is very personal for me. And I also worked a campaign in 2018 where I saw a gigantic global botnet for one of the candidates in that campaign, where accounts on Twitter were pretending to be soccer moms from Orange County, but the geolocator showed them coming from Macedonia and parts in Eastern Europe. So this candidate was falsely amplified to make himself look very popular, and it was all a lie. And so, as complicated as all of this sounds, it is all about truth. And what we just saw in that clip between you and the Facebook executive was that there's nobody who is saying we cannot have foreign interference. There are laws against foreign interference in our elections, but nobody on the tech side doing much about it, certainly not as a result of that conversation at that time. So it's absolutely terrifying to me.
It is terrifying. And what's even more disturbing, well, there's two things that are very disturbing. Firstly, that discussion that you showed took place 4 years ago. And despite the fact that the parliamentary committee that I was on highlighted these issues and called on our government in the UK to take action, they have taken virtually no action in the intervening period to change the law, so that the ungoverned space that existed in 2018, which we highlighted in our committee hearings, remains. So all of the things that were done then could be done again. And that's despite the fact that the government has actually passed legislation relating to elections in the UK. It's chosen not to prevent that type of activity, the overseas interference that we highlighted, which is deeply disturbing. It tells you really how rotten British politics is nowadays, that the government has taken a deliberate decision to continue to allow the framework for overseas interference in elections. And the second really disturbing thing that I thought about the 2018 clip that he showed was that, remember, that was after the 2016 Brexit referendum. It was after the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And yet we had a senior Facebook executive telling me that he'd never thought about overseas interference in elections, something that was a massive issue after the 2016 US presidential election. So I think there's been a lack of candor and honesty from the tech giants. And the early conclusion that I took, that I drew from all of this, is that just as we regulate elections quite tightly in the UK, historically, we've always had very closely regulated and fair elections. Now, that has completely gone out of the window in the past 10 years. And we have this ungoverned space, which is social media, which is beyond the legal ambit of the people who run elections in this country. And the government is allowing that to continue. And until we change governments in the UK, that's likely to remain. So what I'm doing at the moment is trying to work to put in place a legislative framework to actually get back control of elections in the UK, because you will see the state of politics in our country at the moment, and this is the fundamental reason why this has happened.
Wow, Jim.
So you alluded to it, but I think there's a very, very important elephant in the room, which is that just as Brexit was, I guess it's arguable, but not in my mind, it was stolen basically by, a bunch of tactics that changed the outcome in a way that was extremely damaging to Europe, to Britain, to everyone involved. And then immediately after that, they did it here too. And not only did they use the same tactics, it was the literal same people with the same technology and all of the above, right? One person that we alluded to before we got on air is the guy who initially funded Facebook, Peter Thiel, whose entire project is to subvert democracy through things like stolen elections. So I just wanted to not only remind our audience that we're talking about the same cast of characters, to the point that Nigel Farage, after he was done with Brexit, was over in the United States doing campaign stops with Donald Trump, right? There's a reason for that.
One of the extraordinary things about this story, going back to 2016, when I was completely ignorant about all of this, I was out on the street campaigning in the elections and the referendums, but I didn't know any of this was going on, is that there was a very small group of people, probably tens, maybe hundreds of people, probably tens actually, who understood the power of what this could actually achieve in politics and used that knowledge that they had that other people didn't have to influence the elections that took place, very close elections. And as a consequence of that, they've really fundamentally changed politics in both the United States and in the United Kingdom in a way that in my lifetime is unprecedented. And we are still grappling with the consequences of that. What I still find extraordinary is how most politicians, certainly in the UK, and you can speak for the United States, still don't realize the scale of this and what actually happened. And what I felt I needed to do, and the reason I wrote Digital Gangsters, was explain how the scales dropped from my eyes and I actually saw what was happening. And I was fortunate to be on the committee. I'm a lawyer by background, and I came into this without any preconceived ideas. I didn't think Facebook was a bad thing in 2016. I really I didn't know. It was something that I was a little familiar with. I was not an avid user, but I really came into it with a completely open mind. But the evidence that I've seen, and I followed the evidence, and the committee followed the evidence throughout, has led me to the conclusions that it's absolutely essential that we move away from the completely unregulated world of political advertising that we now have. And we have to seize back control, and governments have to take action to put frameworks in place.
We're going to talk about Cambridge Analytica because that's a very, very important component of it. And as I was reading your book and just remembering those committee hearings that you had, remembering Alexander Nix and remembering Brittany Kaiser and all these characters, I feel like this is like, the early days of big tobacco when they're trying to figure out, is this killing us? Is this killing us? Like what's happening here? Is it killing us? And instead of getting executives, saying, yes, you're getting PR flacks diverting. Hi-Fi, why don't you tell Ian about your experience in Washington, D.C.? We had our friend Keir Giles on the show who wrote Russia's War on Everybody, and Hi-Fi went to an event with him in D.C., and his takeaway was a bit alarming.
So I'm in this room, Keir Giles, author, Russia's War on Everybody, and he's explaining to the people in this room, and these are people who work for embassies, military people, think tank people, high ranking. They should understand geopolitics currently. And a question I asked to Keir and to this room was, who is developing the technical capabilities to insert narrative warfare, information warfare, cognitive warfare into the Russian information sphere? Because I feel that is a very, we have to fight back against this. The people in the room laughed.
Yeah.
That's disturbing, I think.
Yeah. It's because they don't understand. They have no conception.
That's right.
That the weapons that they have used throughout their political lives no longer apply. Yeah. They're fighting with bows and arrows when the other guys have got tanks, and they don't realize it. And I was like this. I was fighting campaigns in 2015 using old weapons that didn't work anymore, and my opponents were starting to use the new weapons. And a lot of people are still doing that because they don't realize the world's changed, and they're allowed to laugh at people who are actually pointing out that the world has moved on.
Absolutely. Hi-Fi.
So a follow-up I have to this, and this involves a gentleman you worked with, Charles Creel. We've had him on the program.
Yeah.
Very well.
Everyone should watch People You May Know, his film.
Yeah.
And Disinformed.
Completely.
And Disinformed.
Them, yeah.
But in that film, Charles Creel traces self-reported mental health data through a number of different companies, Glue, Commune.io. Ultimately, what it leads to is people's medical vulnerabilities or personality vulnerabilities are being utilized against them to radicalize them for political means. And what troubles me is that Peter Thiel of Palantir is currently trying to get into the NHS in the UK. His access to that health data seems like a massive national security threat to me. Thoughts?
Well, when I think about using a computer now, I think there's something sitting on my shoulder, watching what I'm doing, and tracing what I'm doing, and all of the information that something collects on my shoulder, I think is going to be used in my life to present me with images or narratives that will persuade me to act in a particular way. So, and I think that most people never think about this for a moment. They think when they're using their computer that it's still a personal thing, and that they never really consider that their use is in no way private, that all of the information and the things that they look at are being collected and are very commonly being used by other people for commercial purposes or for political purposes, and also to influence them. And I think we need to get that simple image across to people, so that they think about what they're doing when they're using computers. I trust no computer.
Yeah.
Now, every time I used to, when I was in politics generally, I thought it was a good policy that anything I put in writing, I would be quite happy if it was on the front page of the Sunday Times in London, so that I needed to be careful about what I said or
Sure.
did, and I think that applies to computers now. Even when I use it in my own private time, you have to be conscious that this is a public world that you're operating in, and all of the information and usage that you make is there and being used. There are laws against that in some respects, sharing of data. But we know from what happened with Cambridge Analytica and with the Facebook involvement in that those laws were kind of subverted. The breach of them doesn't really lead to profound consequences. We know that Jim mentioned Brexit, the Brexit referendum earlier on. We know that the law was broken in that campaign, but it took 2 years from the end of the referendum for that decision, that finding, to be made. And by then, the political caravan had moved on, and it was impossible to take realistic action in respect of that referendum because time had moved on. So we're not in control of this agenda at all. Democracy is not being monitored. It's not being protected by the current law, and as a consequence, we all need to seize back control, to use a phrase that Nigel Farage ironically used relating to Brexit, of our politics, which is now being fought online.
Yes.
And that's where people spend the money nowadays. And if you want to know what the effective means of communication is, look follow the money.
Yeah.
And that's where the money is now spent.
I remember the exact moment when I saw the Trump campaign in 2016 going from like $100 a day spend on Facebook to $1 million a day, $1 million a day. So we saw exactly where that was going. You're looking at 3 people who've had malinformation campaigns run against them all the time. We do this work as civic duty. This is an investigative show about disinformation. We're very serious about investigating it. And so we have had malinformation campaigns run against us relentlessly. And I believe we live in a post-privacy world. If we're going to use computers now, just as you said, expect it to be, on the front page of, in our case, usually online. But I feel, again, like this is something. We had a guest on here, Dr. Stephen Hassan, who's done an incredible amount of work around helping people who have been drawn into cults and who are under undue influence. And he believes this whole data fight is the new nuclear arms race. And we don't even have Western leaders standing up in front of their population and saying, we're a target nation of cognitive warfare. Your brains are the battlefield. We are going to allocate resources to help create awareness. We're going to, have, governmental regulations on big tech. We just rolled. It's like, the tanks are already here and we just rolled. And there's a few people like us who are trying to do this work. But I just feel like, you're right that there's ignorance involved. There's a lack of understanding. That's part of it. But I also just feel like if there aren't some urgent moves made, then we might not recognize truth anymore. That's kind of like the fight we're in.
I think that's absolutely the case. But what is also, for me, even more disturbing is, what? The press aren't interested in this story.
I know.
The most of the so-called hugely influential political journalists think we're all nuts. They think we're all conspiracy theorists. And when I was in Parliament, I was trying to speak to the main political journalists about this as an issue. And And I've been in Parliament for 18 years, and I was a kind of seen as a kind of mainstream politician, and not particularly getting a great deal of attention. But I was saying to them, this is really important. It's a hugely important issue, not just to politics, but to the whole journalistic world, and truth, as you say, which should be at the heart of great journalism, was being undermined. And I still find it very difficult nowadays to get this issue covered by the main networks in the UK. And I'm sure this is the same in the States too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And the politicians will only start to be interested in this when the press start talking about it. Because politicians, and I know this, I was in politics for a long time, politicians follow the agenda that the press takes forward a lot of the time. And it's very, very important for more journalists to get up to speed on all this and to recognize that the world has changed since they schooled themselves and advanced in their journalistic careers, and that we're in a different campaign environment now to the days of Bill Clinton in the States and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in the UK. So the until both the press and the political world realizes that we need to address this hugely vital issue at the heart of our politics, then we're not going to make the progress that we should.
Well, I'm going to jump in and then I'm going to turn it over to Jim, because part of the noisy mob that follows Jim around is press, they're controlled opposition, they're fakes. They're put there to try to subvert truth. He's done a great job of revealing the evidence. And because I have the blessing of writing for Byline Supplement and Byline Times, I did a piece on an indictment against a Kremlin operative named Alexander Ionov. And Ionov, for a decade, was, according to the Department of Justice, paying groups on the left and groups on the right to create chaos and destabilization in America. And when I did that report, I also found out that Nigel Farage and Aaron Banks had made a trip to America to hang out with Dana Rohrabacher, Russia's favorite ex-congressman, in order to raise money and get support for breaking up California. So when we talk about all these same characters, and we talk about, and we on the show talk a lot about how not really ideology, you can't say left or right. We have in California, there's the extreme left operatives trying to make the centrist Democrats look like, extremists, which is just all bunk. So I guess my point is that it's even worse than what you just said. It's not that the press doesn't get it or doesn't want to. It's that we actually have operatives in America who are pro-Kremlin, who actually are actively sabotaging truth. Jim, do you want to dovetail on that?
No, I mean, I'd love to hear what you think. I imagine that same tactic happens in Britain as well, where you have certain journalists who are always pushing the narrative off, right? Yeah. And especially one thing you said before that I think is really important, right, is we're all conspiracy theorists, right?
Yeah.
That accusation, that you're unwell for, bringing up things like psychological warfare, like, online, social engineering and cults and all of this stuff that we see in front of our eyes. The label conspiracy theorist and the labeling of the truth as a conspiracy theory is 100% intentional. It is there to make the truth seem just as crazy as what we're fighting against.
Just picking up on Jim's point there, I spent a lot of time between 2017 and 2019 in Parliament trying to highlight the corrosive influence of Russia on British politics. and pointing out that Russian money or Russian-linked money had been spent supporting candidates in the UK Parliament. And there was a great resistance to this, firstly from many of those candidates, perhaps not surprisingly, but also, again, from the press. We then get a situation where we see what's happened in Ukraine in the last 12, just over 12 months ago.
Yeah.
And people have begun to see that many of the points that were being made back then are actually entirely valid. And the only time, in my experience, since I stood down in 2019, that the press have become more interested in this as a story is when Ukraine was invaded in last year, despite the fact, of course, that the original invasion took place in 2014. So really, this story has become more mainstream because of Vladimir Putin's appalling actions in Ukraine recently. But, the story has not been followed through fully. Unlike in the United States, where you had the Mueller Commission inquiry, we haven't even looked into the Russian involvement in our politics. And what's been achieved in terms of destabilization of our politics in the UK in the last 10 years is off the scale compared to all of the years in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, when I was growing up and we saw those tanks in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. The impact on Britain of what's happened in the last 10 years because of online influence eating away at our politics has been massively more than what happened in the Cold War. It's utterly extraordinary that we don't recognize that fact and that we still don't take it seriously in this country.
It's to ignore the Russian influence and Russian active measures that have been occurring in both our countries and in Western nations and in Africa, and quite frankly, globally at this point, is to basically give up on democracy. Because wherever I look as I do my investigations, I find another, Kremlin sympathizer. And they're revealing themselves more and more as a lot of Jim's work shows that they're not even hiding it anymore. Just so you know the kind of week I've had. Jim has been investigating General Mike Flynn's role in a lot of the radicalization that's been occurring in America. And his brother tweeted out for my arrest. That unleashed a whole series of online death threats, really, really ugly stuff. And this is something that's been occurring for years. And we have, I would like to talk about Carol Cadwalader. I would like to talk about, Hillary Clinton being the very first candidate who was virtually assassinated. I would like to talk about Cambridge Analytica, and I'd like to talk about some of the Russian tentacles that you found. I've turned all my documentation over to intelligence agents. Every time I get another threat, it goes right to a file. So I feel like at least I'm taking some kind of action. But we've just been, those of us who try to tell this story have just been on the receiving end of the kind of harms that we're trying to fight in order to still have a democracy for our children in the future. The attacks are real if you try to actually, alert people to it.
All they have to do is open their eyes, and they see them there. In the UK, we had a nerve agent attack in 2018, which was Russian linked. Even at that time, the government would not countenance the history of Russian interference in our politics, particularly in the Brexit referendum. They wouldn't even look into the issue because they were so obsessed with securing leaving the European Union, that they were prepared not to look at the threats to our democracy that were coming out of the Russian regime, and that those threats are real is evidenced, of course, by the invasion of the Crimea in 2014 and the further invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But we had a government then that, and in many respects, we still have a government now in the UK that closes its eyes to the threats that are really there.
So I have a question that I like to ask people when they try to tell me I'm full of it when it comes to Russia and meddling in politics and all the money laundering, all the broken election laws, and the question is, are you incompetent or are you complicit? Because it seems to me that that's kind of where we are at this point in time. But I want to ask you about a fellow who's caused a lot of trouble both in your country and in my country. And that man's name is Rupert Murdoch.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that he was, telling lies here in America that led to our attempted coup.
Mm-hmm.
We know that in the UK, he was hacking phones and engaged in all sorts of cyber skullduggery. What was done to him in the UK? Like, what penalties were given to him for the horrible things that he engaged in? And do you think that has emboldened him to his actions in the United States, or has it deterred him from his actions?
I think in the long term, really no substantial action was taken against Rupert Murdoch in the UK. He was, in the short term, made to come to Parliament and humiliated to some extent in front of a committee there. But his business continued to some extent as usual. He closed down one title, replaced it with another with a different name. But he has really created a backcloth in British politics. It's not just in Britain. Australia is a similar example, and then moving on to the United States of disinformation, which has been built on in the social media age. Because one of the main issues for the European Union in the UK has been that throughout the time that we were in, from 1972, there was an attack by the Murdoch press on the European Union in the most dominant newspapers and media environment in the UK against the European Union the whole time. This is decades long, and many people had their views of the European Union poisoned by that backcloth, and that was picked up by people with online campaigning subsequently. And I think one of the great mistakes of the Labour government between 1997 and 2010 was that it didn't really take any steps on media regulation, so that we have a very concentrated media world, particularly amongst newspapers in the UK, where very few people own most of the media and pursue political agendas without paying taxes here and have huge political influence. And I think if we are to have an alternative government in the UK, one of the first things they need to do is seize back an element of control in terms of independent regulation of the press and ownership of the press, because it's largely controlled by people who don't live here, have a particular political viewpoint, and don't really allow a free-based, free and open discussion of the political world. We've had that for decades in this country, and unfortunately, we've kowtowed to those press barons in the UK rather than taking action to have an open and free press.
One of your largest papers, The Independent, is owned by a Russian oligarch and a Middle Eastern petroleum oligarch. And I find that amusing because that is the same periodical that did an article about Jim over there when he got kicked off of Twitter.
Yeah.
What's
So
even more amusing is that our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, previous Prime Minister, put him in the House of Lords, the owner.
yeah, yeah,
And
we saw that.
he's a member of the legislature in
We
this
saw
country,
that. Yeah.
just because he's not elected in any way. He's been
Yeah.
put there because of his relationship with Boris Johnson. And
Yes.
that's the way our country works at the moment.
So
That's
it's
a
funny.
problem.
It's funny that you should mention that, High Five, because that's where I was going with this. I just reported this weekend in Byline Supplement about the active disinformation campaigns around science when it comes to the pandemic and vaccines, and how so much of it was coming from the Russian Federation. And of course, here Trump was also, promoting, anti-science rhetoric and, different types of medication bullshittery and whatnot. One of our great allies, Brent Allpress, who does a lot of open source investigations and actually is the one who revealed all the players in the Council for National Policy. His investigations determined that this disinformation at its core was because of US and Russian oil interests, and that they did not want this global pandemic to depress the price and demand for oil. And so much of what we find, unfortunately, goes back to fossil fuel interests. So when you have a leader of what is essentially a mafia state defenestrating people, poisoning people, stealing people's children, trying to steal people's stuff, marching in countries. Do you think that the reason the West has been, enabling him for so long has to do with the fact that Russia is the second largest supplier of petro? Because I don't see why else we would be dancing around true consequences for the Russian Federation.
I think that the motivations of a lot of politicians are about getting elected at the next election. And, I mentioned one of the first things that drew me to this story before I got involved in the tech aspect to it was that I saw in British politics that there were Russian linked donations happening, which I didn't really understand. And they were going to individual members of parliament in marginal constituencies across the country. And I couldn't really work out why this was happening and what was going on. And that's one of the reasons I started to lift the stone and look underneath. And I didn't really understand the motivations of why this was happening. But I think there are people with bigger fish to fry, to mix all my metaphors here. There are people who have agendas which are much, much bigger than most politicians have on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of, it sounds slightly like Blofeld in the James Bond movies, but they're almost using politicians as chess pieces. Mm-hmm. And the strategy is much bigger than the day-to-day life of our politics. And I think that in today's political world, it's about getting through to lunchtime, not about thinking of the world in 10 years' time. And having been a member of parliament for 18 years, I know that the pressures that are there. And part of the reason I stood down was to write this book, because I felt that there was a strategic importance to getting this on the record. And I knew that I couldn't really devote my attention to it properly if I was still in the House of Commons, which is one of the reasons I stood down. And but I do think that there are strategic goals that are being pursued by non-politicians, who are using politicians to implement those goals.
Yes, well, or intelligence agents, as we just learned with, New York FBI. We actually had a, intelligence officer working for Oleg Deripaska. So one thing I want to say is, the work we do feels very dystopian at times, because it feels like it's, unsolvable, and it's not. There are many easy fixes to this. There just needs to be some will. But in your book, you noted that there was one sliver of light that came through, and it was the election of Joe Biden in America. And if you had Joe Biden's ear, and I will make sure this gets to him because a friend of mine just got hired to work for his administration in a high position, so this will get in his ear. What would you tell our president to inspire action to preserve democracy from big tech's unregulated essential anarchy?
This can't, I would say, this cannot be a matter for self-regulation by tech companies. This is a matter where governments and parliaments must be in control in setting the rules for democracy. We've had a classic example of that with what's happened at Twitter, with a change in ownership of a huge platform and an approach by the new owner which has changed the rules entirely. I mean, there was to be no political advertising on Twitter. I remember really welcoming that announcement, which was back just before I stood down in 2019. Then all of a sudden, one man changes his mind, and we have a huge tech platform suddenly gets involved in politics again. That cannot be right in a democracy, and we need to get the legislatures to seize back control, to set parameters to fighting elections, and to make that, and they will be accountable for setting those parameters. There'll be a lot of discussion about what they should be, and they will differ in different countries. But the important principle is that there has to be democratic control of the democratic processes. It's as simple as that. We can't let private businesses control our democracy.
It's like having private business own the water system, right?
Well,
because you don't want that. You don't, because a bad person can get a hold of the water system, and then everyone, things can happen.
Yeah,
it's the same thing. It's a utility.
Yeah,
right. Communicating with other human beings is something that should be free of people trying to influence and radicalize you. I think it's that simple, and I just wanted to say thank you for writing the book, and coming and showing us this exact same process with these exact same people are happening all over the world, and we need to face it as a global citizenry, at the risk of being called a globalist or something. we need to recognize as human beings that we're being manipulated psychologically on purpose.
But it is a problem everywhere. It's a global problem. And one of the great things we did on our committee when I was in the House of Commons was that we worked with other parliaments in Canada, in right across the globe, across Europe, and in Australasia as well. And there is some progress, and there are shafts of light. And the reason why politics, despite it all, ultimately can be a noble profession is it's only politics that can solve this. Yeah. And if we are to have democracies functioning properly and working again, then we have to start by seizing back control from the tech companies and from the overseas interference. And thanks to you too, firstly for asking me onto the show, because lots of people don't, in the UK, and I will continue to fight the fight, and because I think it's an important fight, and I hope you do too. I'm sure you will.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so much for your time. Promise to come back. Everybody buy his book. It's available now at the Byline's website. It's Digital Gangsters, the inside story of how greed, lies, and big tech broke democracy. And that is so true. And we're here to try to fix it. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
That's history, man.
How is it not obvious to people if they've seen any of our shows, any of the movies we recommend, read any of the books we recommend, that Ian's right? It's digital gangsters pulling this.
Yeah, right. And that Russia's involved, and time to get the metaphorical head out of the arse media and help report this stuff. Yeah. All right.
That'd be nice.
That'd be nice. That'd be nice.
Yeah, that'd be very nice. Very nice.
So tell you what we're going to do. Let's hear from a woman in Russia who actually knows what time it is.
Оно оболванило наш народ совершенно, и поэтому люди так отвечают.
Вас на телевидении не оболванило? Почему тогда оболванились все? Многие, не все, конечно, но многие.
Мне сейчас уже 92-й год. Я пережила 4 войны. Я умею думать, я умею анализировать. Ну, неужели вы думаете, я буду слушать этих Соловьёва, эту тетку, которая, как ее, я даже не помню. Ну, неважно. У нас очень плохо последние годы поставлено образование. Вот если мы станем воспитывать хорошо наших детей, то вот эти молодые люди, которые в Буче и все прочее, этого просто не случилось бы, потому что это дикари, воспитанные нашим телевидением. Вот и все.